Okay, well, thank you very much, Susan. Next up, we have Caroline Partridge from Chimera, who's going to look at how and when people perform simultaneous activities and how that's impacted by things like age and gender and so on.
Hello, I'm Caroline Partridge. I'm working with Ben and Paul on the e-society project that Ben talked about at the beginning. I confess I saw Susan's slides and knew she was presenting before me, so when I'm talking about multitasking, I haven't gone into, to avoid repetition, all the theory behind why multitasking is of theoretical interest. Just kind of proceeded straight on to the results. My own definition of multitasking is, handily enough, pretty much the same as Susan's, which is, according to how it's recorded in a diary study, people recording more than one activity at the same time in the same time slot, which I think is pretty much the same. Okay. So Ben talked a bit about our e-society project in his first talk, but to recap, we're investigating the impact of technology on different areas of society to see how, with time use, technology might change the way people spend their time. We're interested in 6 areas of the way people might spend their time. We're interested in shopping, travel, leisure time, indoor and outdoor, media use, which in practical terms, according to the data we have, is TV, and social life. And Ben's already explained the theoretical interests we have in looking at how differences in how people spend their time in each of these activities. The idea being that when you introduce a new technology, you might be able to see, looking at historical data, changes in the way people spend their time. The data set I use is different from the one Susan's used. It's the data set that Ben talked about in his first presentation, the Home Online data set, which is a longitudinal data set, i.e. the same people were interviewed and surveyed over 3 consecutive periods, 1998, 2000 and 2001, I believe. There was a big household survey. There were over 1,000 households took part in that, but only 303 households completed a time use diary in all 3 waves. Of these, there were 35 categories. We're interested in 6 particular categories, and so we aggregated the variables. So, for example, one of our variables of interest was indoor leisure, so we took aspects such as reading, listening to the radio, listening to tapes or CDs, and aggregated them all together to produce a single variable that we called indoor leisure. Everything clear so far? Yep. So, first of all, before I go on to actually talking about secondary activities, i.e. multitasking, I think it's useful to look at primary activities, because you can't really draw any conclusions about how much time people are spending in secondary activities before you know how much time they're actually spending on the primary activity. So if, for example, you want to look at how getting the internet has changed what people do when they're watching TV, you need to know first how much time they're spending watching TV. Just because it's of interest to the project, I've broken these down into a couple of different socio-demographic variables. I've looked at males and females, people who have children and who don't have children, and I also looked at people in different 5-year age group to try and consider changes over people's life stages. But there simply weren't enough people once you break down all the different variables, like getting internet, not having internet. There weren't enough people, so I've left that out. And the main thing that's different from my work to Susan's work is the way I've been looking at the way people multitask, while Susan, I believe, has been looking at it in a sort of gross aggregate way. I've been looking at it over the course of a day to look at differences in time, so what people do in the morning versus what they do in the afternoon versus what they do in the evening. This may have been a mistake, as I'll come on to later on. So I've broken down all the results into waking hours, which are defined as 7 in the morning till 11 o'clock, just as a sort of average representation of when people are awake. And then into 1-hour slots. So everything I've got is, say, 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock, 8 o'clock to 9 o'clock. So you can see the trends over the course of a day. So these are just a couple of sample results of primary time. So nothing to do with multitasking at the moment, just how people are spending their time in our variables of interest. The first thing to note is that people don't report very much time spent on a lot of these activities. The average of social life is about 5, 6 minutes in each of the hour-long slots. These are the y-axis is mean minutes per hour, and then the x-axis is the time period. So you can see from left to right is the time over the course of a day. So the blue line is male, the pink line is female. That's just the way Excel drew them. I've been challenged on this already by Ben. And there's really not very much difference. You might say that females spend a little bit less time socialising between the hours of 4 and 7, but by and large, that's pretty much the same line. I spotted there's a mistake in this, and I spotted this after I'd sent the slides in to Joan. So these two lines should be reversed. This is the line for people who don't have children. This is the line for people who do have children. So when you look at social life in terms of how many kids you have, surprise, surprise, people who don't have children manage to spend an awful lot more time on social life than those poor people who do have children, who only manage to spend between 2 or 3 reported minutes per hour, as opposed to the lucky folks who don't have children, who spend up to about 10 minutes per hour. So that's just one of the ways in which socio-demographic differences can be shown. When you look at television watching, apparently ladies watch a little bit less television than the gents. But again, the big difference is between those who have children and those who don't have children. Here, again, those who have children are spending an awful lot more time watching television. No great surprise when you look at the actual times they're watching television, between sort of 2, 3 in the afternoon to about the time the kids go to bed at night. Okay, so I'll sort of pause there because that's kind of the first bit. Is everyone with me so far? Yeah. Okay, so on to the multitasking, that's secondary activities that are occurring at the same time as people are doing our primary 6 tasks of interest. Yes?
Can I just ask him, was it down to the person's discretion and their perception of whether they'd say, for example, my primary thing now is I'm watching television rather than childcare?
So
it's down to...
Yes, that's completely up to the person, whatever they think is the main thing that they're doing. Unlike Susan, I'm not looking at things like paid work and childcare because they're not variables that are of particular interest to our project. So childcare would obviously be, when you're looking at having kids or not, would obviously be a huge secondary activity. It just happens that that's not something that we're considering in this project. Okay, so looking at multitasking, we did have a problem with the numbers, in that of the 303 people who completed diaries, they didn't all complete a full survey, which was the socio-demographic variables, including, do you have a mobile phone? Do you have the internet? Are you male? Do you have children? Etc. So that took a number of potential participants right down. So what I did was to pool the data for the 3 samples to increase the number of participants. So given that I was interested in what changes happen when people go online, and what changes happen when people acquire a mobile phone, you can take out the people who got a mobile phone and who got the internet during the course of the survey. So those who got the internet, say, between wave 1 and 2, or between wave 2 and 3, you can take those people out and pool them together. But you can also look at exactly the same set of people 1 year before. So for the people who went online between wave 1 and wave 2, you look at them in wave 1, which was the point just before they got the internet. The ones who went online between wave 2 and wave 3, you look at them in wave 2, which is just before they got the internet. So the theory is that when I present the results, the only difference between the 2 sets is whether or not they got this particular technology or not. So they're the same set of people with the same set of socio-demographic variables, but there's just one thing that's changed. Okay. So, my own hypotheses were pretty similar to Susan's. That going online was the first one, will show increased multitasking in home-based activities on the theory that most people, even today, go online with a PC in the home. So there's no particular reason to suspect that multitasking in outdoor activities is going to be affected by the internet. But things like social life, indoor leisure, TV watching, may well be affected for the theoretical reasons that Susan talked about why the internet can promote multitasking. Mobile phones, on the other hand, could show increased multitasking in any of our 6 activities of interest. Richard Ling wrote a very interesting book called The Cell Phone in 2004, where he notes a number of properties of mobile phones. He says the mobile phone fits into the folds of everyday life. And he notes that people will use their mobile phone in the times and spaces that are otherwise unoccupied, such as waiting for a bus, being on a train, or whatever. And another property of mobile phones that he notes is that they're used for the micro-coordination of social activities. So maybe 10 years ago, you might make a phone call to arrange to meet someone for dinner. These days, while you're travelling, you can change the arrangements with your mobile phone, which is what micro-coordination is. You can sort of reiterate your plans while you've actually started to carry out your plans, as it were. So I was particularly interested in the impact of mobile phones on travel. So how much multitasking there would be when travel was reported as the primary activity, according to whether or not people had a mobile. Okay. So this is on to the results. The graphs are the same x and y axis as before, mean minutes per hour on the y axis and time of day across the x axis. So the first thing to note was that outdoor leisure and shopping produced very, very little in the way of secondary activities at all, regardless of whether or not there was any new ICT present. I've only included these as an example. There is less than 1 minute per hour recorded in secondary activities. I mean, there's like, these graphs are like, less than 10 seconds per hour reported. So as such, unfortunately, the secondary activities going on are not really of interest. It's simply not happening. With regard to outdoor leisure, it isn't actually that surprising. If you think about it, if people are playing sports or they're at the cinema, that's probably all they're doing. It's not the kind of thing that you'd necessarily want to record a secondary activity for. With shopping, which I haven't included but is a very similar graph, it's pretty much the same thing. I was a little bit more surprised at that, but apparently when people go out shopping, that's all they do. They shop. They don't really record anything else. So those 2 variables of interest are out of it. Right, I'm going to present a couple of graphs according to our results on internet access, and then I'll move on to mobile phones. So, indoor leisure. This top graph, the smaller one, is kind of a sort of reference graph. This is how much primary activity there was in indoor leisure through the day, so that you can compare it with the bigger graph, which is the amount of secondary activities going on during indoor leisure. So it's not saying what those secondary activities are at the moment, it's simply saying this is how much multitasking is going on when the primary activity is indoor leisure. Like Susan, we found that there's obviously much less secondary activity recorded compared to primary activity. Between 1 and 2 mean minutes per hour is recorded, as opposed to between, say, about 5 and 8 for the primary activity. So there's about sort of a 30% chance of secondary activity. This is the only result of interest for getting the internet. The dark blue line represents those who were about to get the internet. So it was 1 year before they went online. The pink line is what changed when they got the internet. And for this result only, it shows that the internet does have an impact on multitasking, because nothing else has changed in these people's lives that we know of, in that they record a bit more multitasking. The actual differences are quite small, but then so are the numbers of secondary activities when you record them on an hourly basis. By the way, the age range of the participants were just those are in working life. They're 20 to 59-year-olds only. We took out all the children, all the old people, because we thought they might behave differently. Now, this is an example of how things didn't change when we looked at the other variables of interest. Again, the top graph is primary TV watching. This is secondary, the big graph is secondary activities during TV watching, and there's pretty much no difference between those who got the net and those who were about to get the net. I was hoping there would be a difference. I was hoping that the internet, if people had it in their living rooms, for example, would result in much more multitasking while people were getting the internet. As we've found out from the data, people don't tend to have the PC in their living room, so in retrospect, this is a bit less of a surprising result. Okay, so going on to when people got mobile phones, the results are a bit more interesting. Again, the top graph is primary activity. In this case, it's social life. The blue line is the people who were about to get a mobile phone, and the pink line is the people who just got a mobile phone in 1998 to 2001. And people record more multitasking during their social life when they've just got a mobile phone, which is great. Similarly, I hope, travel. Travel was the variable I was particularly interested in with regard to mobile phones. It was the variable I had the most hope for seeing some good results in. Didn't quite work out that way. The top graph shows primary travel, so you can see the expected peaks, sort of 7 to 9 o'clock, 5 to 7 o'clock in travel time. Those peaks don't reflect at all in how much multitasking people are reporting. The people who are about to get a mobile phone report almost no multitasking at all during travel time. If they're travelling, they're not doing anything else at all. The spikes are just between about 30 seconds and 1 minute per hour. They're not really spikes. The only point of interest is the people who just got the mobile who have this odd spike at lunchtime. And if there's any theoretical reasons people can come up with for why people multitask at lunchtime and not in commuting times, then please feel free.
Because mobiles don't work when you're travelling, because you're going in and out of signals. They're hopeless if you're commuting, whereas at lunchtime you hop out of the office to call home. But
yeah, that's a good one.
I think perception, we mentioned earlier, perception of what multitasking is. I mean, a lot of people travelling would perhaps read a paper or a book, but not consider that multitasking. But it's a form of relaxation as you travel, really, or a form of...
Yeah. Another thing I did think of is that this was the time of the data collection was before the texting revolution. I think if we had data from today, we might see more multitasking because of people sending texts. But this was actually really before texting took off. But again, that's just a theory.
Can I make a comment that at CTS, where I did work, some colleagues are doing ethnographies of travel time use, and by far the most common thing that people were doing whilst travelling was window gazing, which actually doesn't sound like multitasking at all, but actually it's a form of relaxation. So again, it comes back to the
getting
definition
people
of
to record
multitasking.
it in a time diary as such, of course it probably wouldn't show up.
Exactly.
We are constrained by these being what people have reported.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. So the next obvious question to ask is, what are people doing? If we're saying that the internet has an impact on indoor leisure, the mobile phone has an impact on social life, what is it that people are doing? What's changed? And unfortunately, when you come to look at the in-depth activities that people are recording as their secondary activities, you would hope that PC use going online would go up massively, that making and receiving calls would go up massively. It doesn't, unfortunately. When you look at activities on an hour-by-hour basis and thus restrict your data, basically the data it's not particularly comprehensible. On the left-hand side, this represents people who just got the internet. On the right-hand side is people who were just about to get the internet, and this is what they were doing while they were watching television. On first glance, it might look like they were being visited by friends a lot more when they just got the internet, and when they were about to get the internet, they were reading a lot more. But when you actually go and look at the raw data, what I found was that there were 2 or 3 people who were just recording these activities time and time again over a long period, and that they are actually accounting for all this, this apparent rise in the amount of reported activities. And when you look at your variables of interest, it's less than, it's much, much less than 1 mean minute per hour. And that is a flaw in the way I chose to look at the data, I think, sequentially over the time of day when compared to the number of people I actually have reporting. It means that when you look at this kind of fine level, really I can't make any more conclusions than that. So, conclusions. Going online and getting a mobile phone do have an impact on the amount of multitasking in some of our variables of interest. Indoor leisure for the internet, social life for the mobile phone. But we're only talking about 2 to 3 minutes per hour, so it's hard to make really substantial conclusions when you're talking about this small amount of time. My next step is to stop considering different times of day. I think that's a little bit flogging a dead horse, and actually go on to more of the methodology that Susan used, which is considering it over the course of a day when you can aggregate things and hopefully get a much sort of better idea of more gross change. The data I used are limited in their use because they were 1998 to 2001 data. So they did perceive mobile phones becoming ubiquitous for the majority of the population. So these data, when you look at people who are getting mobile phones, we know that they're richer people in general. They're not a representative sample. And it was definitely before the broadband revolution, so it's a little bit more difficult to assess the impact of the internet. But the project's not finished, and there's more research to be done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Any comments then? Questions?
Well, I'd comment that you get a very different picture if you did it now. The Ofcom data that's just recently come out in the communications market shows a definable decline in television watching, particularly amongst 16 to 24-year-olds. The more time spent online and other activities, so I think we get updated data.
Yeah, as Susan said, there is a bit of a paucity in the data on people who have completed these lengthy time diary studies. There's more survey data out there, and there's a lot of cross-sectional data out there, but it's longitudinal data that we find really interesting and useful.
I think maybe one thing I find is that you don't get much sense of engagement. I think it's quite difficult to ask, for example, a 17-year-old or whatever age it might be, but are you watching television? This idea of watching television, what do we actually mean when we ask that question? Because it may be on in the background, but they might not consider that as multitasking. I might not be actively engaged, but I still have it on, and I still might glance up and get that advertiser's message or catch that program. But I think that, a lot of the problem with the data we have is that it doesn't actually go into that subtlety. I don't know if anyone else agrees.
The main problem, of course, a lot of it, if you will, is it's claimed rather than actual data, which it's all been Holy Grails of getting it, but that too often most of their findings are based on bar data plus some sort of going out and talking to people. So it's closer, but then somebody's got the TV on, they're sat in front of it, even though it's recording it again. So it's tricky, but it's back to multi-methodologies, and so the ethnographic plus as much real rather than plain data as you can get, observation and real data, but that's not cheap.
Yes.
What I found quite amusing was the way that our own intentionally quantitative data ended up being from a quantitative case study. By the time you get down to the level of
the granularity.
Question.
You have lots of money.
So it's actually more of a comment. I'm Jamie, also from the Future Foundation. It's interesting because we did some similar analysis of this data, and we found that kind of 2 to 3 minutes per hour for these secondary activities just didn't seem intuitively right. And so we kind of thought, we did some kind of quant analysis, and I think it says like 40% of people use the net and watch TV at the same time, which would indicate more time spent on those things. So it would seem that, when you're using time use data, the activities which you're interested in, are very dependent on the data. So, looking at multitasking for media doesn't seem to work particularly well. So looking for multitasking amongst perhaps other areas.
Yeah, my name's Andrew Stephen. I've recently started working at ippr. Kind of a link question really about this idea of getting quality data. I think that's linked to using multitasking as a guise for kind of the whole examination of it. I think the lived experience of a lot of people is that what technology does is it allows you to fragment your tasks. And I mean, particularly for myself, it's not so much a case of multitasking or what I identified as that, but it allows me to jump in between different tasks. I mean, you use the example of being on a train and sending a text. Well, I'm with you to that extent that it's multitasking because one's passive and one's active. But the idea of kind of two active events going on at the same time, I think perhaps should be considered more as sort of fragmentation idea of technology.
But actually the time diary data should capture that, because it doesn't necessarily mean things you're doing at exactly the same time. It's things that occur in the same time slot. So it might be fragmented. As you say, it's a case of giving...
But then you're asking people to report accurately about that, and it's sort of the impact that technology is having, if anything, is making it more difficult to get sort of robust data about what people are doing.
Sure, yeah.
Any other comments or questions before we move on? No? Okay. Sorry.
Because I don't agree with you. There are a lot of activities that are genuinely multitask. And any woman who's ever breastfed knows that.
Yeah, I was waiting for the gender divide.
But there are also activities like walking your dog to work while having a conversation with a colleague, where you can, or any activity that involves supervisory care. So you can be talking to someone and watching your children, and you are focused on what they're saying to you, but you are also keeping an eye on what the kids are doing, and you may have differential levels of attention at the same time, but you actually are doing things at the same time.
Yeah.
So it is possible to have actually coterminous multitasking as well as to be rapidly shifting.
Okay. Any more? One more.
I wonder whether in that case that time use diary data is the best way of recording these things. Because on top of that you've got to have people filling in the diary. And I'm just wondering if as a methodology for these things instead of perhaps the best way.
I would argue yes, because there aren't other ways to get that information. The reason is if you ask someone, how much of your day do you spend using your mobile phone while doing other things? That's an almost impossible question to answer, because then you have to go back. What you effectively have to do to try to answer that question is to take the time diary, because you have to remember what it was you were doing during the day and where it was you had the mobile phone on and you were also doing something else at the same time. So really the more efficient way to capture is to get people to give you a full narrative account of what was happening during that day. And the time diary is a form of narrative account of the activities that were going on. So you can't really get the information without using the narrative. Whether certain existing diary surveys is always the best way to do that is a different question, but I don't think you can do it without the narrative element of data extraction. And the time diary does let you get a large-scale sample, even though some of the data sets we've had here have been relatively small.
Quick comment here and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, I would disagree with you about the relevance of time use data now if we're trying to understand this kind of thing. In our study, we ran some focus groups after the study. We had 3 waves last year, and people suggested that actually they weren't completing their diary as things happened. They were filling it out almost like a survey at the end of the day. And so I would suggest that perhaps time-use diaries aren't as good as we think they are, because they're not being used in the way that we think they should be, and perhaps ethnographies are the way to go in time-use research.
There's one way around that little part of the problem, which is things like touch points. Big industry studies have been very much kind of medium focused. PDA that flashes at you and keeps flashing at you until you fill it in every 15 minutes. Which doesn't mean it doesn't completely disturb what you're doing, but short of stalking people, I don't quite see the answer.
That's a problem for research.